All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone, welcome to the Exploring Discovery webinar. So I'm your account manager, Jeremy Newman, and thank you for registering and attending this webinar. I'm quite excited to be bringing this to you. It's been a while in the making. So this webinar, as many of you have guessed and saw, is solely about the discovery tool and how to utilize it, what it's about, any questions you may have. And this webinar was developed solely because of feedback from you, the users. From a lot of webinars, there's a lot of questions about the discovery tool and what it's about. So this, take this hour to try to explain it to you and any questions you have as well. So as I mentioned, if you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the question module in the GoToWebinar interface, and I'll be able to answer them. They can be very basic questions about how to use discovery to, very complex and granular about reporting or certain fields. As always, if there are any audio or video issues during the webinar, if you can't hear me, if my voice starts getting choppy, if the screen starts lagging a lot, or worse yet, if my screen is frozen and you don't see what I'm talking about, please let me know by writing in the question module or writing into the chat interface, either one, and I'll try to fix the issue as soon as possible. So when you log into RelSci, this is the home page everyone will see. And the thing is, discovery is at the very bottom of the right-hand toolbar. So this causes one of the issues is most people don't actually see it when they log in. It actually isn't viewable on the toolbar. So to get there, you obviously scroll down a bit, and there's discovery. And a lot of people don't end up clicking it too often because the main tools they use are PowerSearch, Pathfinder, maybe profiles and lists. However, discovery is not a pared-down version of PowerSearch. It's not a pared-down version of anything, really. It's an entirely different tool. It has different use cases. So the question I'm asked a lot is, what is discovery? What does it do? What's it about? And the answer I generally give at the start is, discovery is a macro-level pathfinder. It's a different way of viewing paths. And while this is true, discovery is a lot more than just that. So a couple other common questions are, what are some use cases for discovery? And how do you actually use it within RelSci? So the use cases can be very broad and vary a lot from client to client. Some of these clients have come up with on their own. Others, we've kind of developed and because of a lot of demand for it. So one of them is marketing. This one came purely from a user, actually. And this was specifically for profit, but I can potentially see some nonprofits or even better yet, universities using this. And what this for-profit did was they gathered their investors list, their board member list, their investment service firms. So they also had hedge fund managers, private equity managers, and then the underlying companies for both. And what they did was they put this list into RelSci, combined them into one master list, and then using that, input it into Discovery. And more or less what Discovery did then was it shows you everyone's potential connections and your reach through them. So that'd be more or less going to each person that was in that list, thousands and thousands of people, getting their Rolodex, and then compiling it into Excel with all the data, and then seeing how it breaks down by industry, by role, and by location. That is nigh impossible. So that is why one of the reasons why Discovery is so powerful. And they're using that for marketing. Another one is idea generation. So as I always mention, you always go into Pathfinder here when you have a specific goal in mind or a specific person you're looking up. It could be a list, a prospect list you want to try to path to. It could be an individual. You could be hosting an event and have the registration list. You want to see how, the attendees know each other. But if you don't really know where to start and kind of want to explore different avenues and different options, Discovery is the place to go. So think, okay, if I don't know where to go, just like when you come into RelSci and you're like, oh, I know the exact person I want, I'm going to use the smart search bar up here and search Bill Gates. And then you pull up his profile. And then also, when you don't know the exact person you want, but you have their criteria, you go to PowerSearch. It's the same idea. Pathfinder, when you have the specific person you want to go to. Discovery, when you kind of have an idea, but you're not entirely sure. Targeting board members by city, analytics, Discovery has the best reporting features in the platform, in my opinion, and the most robust. If you're branching into a new location or a new industry, so if it's a new campaign starting in a new region, maybe you have a new gift officer that's in a region that hasn't really been covered before, or you're branching into an industry, whether it be for fun or you're targeting a new industry if you're a wealth manager, and you want to generate some ideas. A few other ones, event planning, very common one, and a lot more. I've had clients come up with ideas I've never heard of before. So it's really whatever you can see Discovery being used for, try it out. All right, so digging into it. So there's two modules in Discovery. There's the top module here, and then at the bottom there's a second module here. And they both do slightly different things. They're not the same. So the first module is taking a look, in this case what it comes default as your relationships. Your relationship web, my firm's relationships. It does depend on how your account is set up. So in this case, it's my relationship web. It's taking a look at these 4,132 relationships and breaking them down by industry, location, and role. And so kind of gives you a quick pie chart here and brief breakdown. If we click into industry by clicking the by industry here, it'll open up this pie chart. And this breaks down, okay, through my relationship web, where does my firm have connections? Where does my institution have connections, my colleagues? And so if you go around the pie chart here, this is one way to do it. You can see in the middle kind of a brief summary of who your firm has access to in certain industries. So computer software, number of people you have access to, number of organizations, the most connected organizations, top locations, top roles, etc. If you do not like this kind of view, if you don't want the exploring, you have a specific industry in mind, let's say, what you'd want to do is on the left side, you'd want to go down here and click into the industry you're looking for. Now, one thing to make a note of, there has been a few enhancements to Discovery over the past year due to demand, actually. So when Discovery first launched, I think it was over a year and a half or 2 years ago, it was a great tool, but there was a few bugs and a few kinks to work out. One of which was we included all of these industries, but we did not include a section that compiled them all together. So all industries is an option, and you can click into it to see that. That came directly from a client request. So if we click into investment services and portfolio management, breaks down by organizations first. So standard view, take a look at organizations. Same thing, you can take a look at the companies on the left side. And what's great here is there's multiple layers you can filter on. So you can report here if you want. There's a report feature. You can filter further down. So let's say you want to filter by industry, but also by location. Let's say I'm taking a look at investment services and portfolio management, but I also only want to take a look at investment services and portfolio management in New York City or in Chicago. I can do that. I can also do it by roles as well if I want to drill down here. And so what's great here is you can take a look at the organizations your firm or your board or your trustees have the most access to. So, okay, let's see. It looks like Canada Pension Plan we have the most access to in terms of investment services and portfolio management. You hover over this little pie chart here. If the system cooperates with me, it actually breaks it down by who you know there and how many strong, average, and weak connections you have. So if I click into Canada Pension Plan, Investment Board, and Private Investments, it'll break down, what their role is there. So it looks like Andreas is the managing director and head of EMEA, currently at least, senior principal, etc., etc. And the great thing about Discovery, and I always keep stressing it to any client that I talk about Discovery to, is almost every page is reportable, and each report will be slightly different. So it's not like the same report will happen if you report on the first page to the last. It's going to vary. So take a look, see what report kind of fits your needs and what you want. So going back to this screen, So we're no longer in a specific organization, we're back to the people and organization. If we go to people, this is great if you're really just interested about people and you don't care about the organizations they're associated with. For instance, for nonprofits, if you're doing major gifts, really not that important what organization they're associated with. Same with wealth management. Sometimes you're just targeting the individual. And in this case, there's a few cool tricks here. The report feature as well will be different than any other page. You can filter here, but I think I might have shown a few people this in previous webinars. But if you click this 2 roles that, in this case, Gary matched on, click this, open up in a new tab. It'll actually break down what roles Gary has that fulfills our criteria. So in this case, there's 2 roles that fulfill the investment services and portfolio management criteria. It also breaks down by location. So if you really want a nice, clean report on Gary's role in this industry, it gives location, what locations they are, and what roles he's had at these industries, in these specific organizations, I should say. So he's managing partner over at Lauder Partners, private equity and venture capital firm that's based in Atherton, California. And he's also currently involved, he's an advisor with iHatch Ventures, which is based in New York City. So going kind of back up. So now we're back to that pie chart we saw earlier. And as you can tell, there's actually a whole different report button here for this pie chart. It kind of gives a brief summary of everything you see here. So if you kind of want a nice quick summary of how you're connected with industries, hit report here and you'll get it. Now that's just, I'll go back to the main discovery page. That's just industries. So there's one for location, so you can come into location here and break it down by a specific city. And it's the same thing. You go into CL organizations and it will break it down by the organizations and the individuals. And this happens for role, for location, and for industry. You can filter, etc. Now, talking about use cases, I did discuss them for industry. If you're kind of doing a top-down analytical project, you want to see where your reach into certain industries are, that's great for for-profits. Also, if you want to see, for instance, Pathfinder cannot tell you, I want to see how many people we know in the private equity industry. Pathfinder can't do that. It would take a lot longer to compile that information. Discovery can tell you that very quickly. Same with any other industry, same with any other location or role. Like how many founders do we know? How many board members do we have access to? Click into role for you nonprofits out there. How many board members do we have access to? How many trustees? Maybe you're a consultant for nonprofits and really you get new clients by talking with new board members or board members of your current clients, because usually they sit on other boards of other nonprofits. Take a look at your board members and see what connections you have and where you can potentially navigate to new clients. All right, that is just the first module with one input. If you have questions about the default input, write in. So I'm not moving on to the second module because the first module can be changed, just like Pathfinder, just like many other tools. First, there is this thing called connections. First degree connections are the one-hop paths. So as you see, first degree connections mean it's just taking a look at the 4,132 connections up here. Second degree connections, which I will not load, is going to take a look at one-hop paths. It's going to take a look at all of the potential people we have connections to through those 4,132. So it'll take, the number of people or organizations you have access to and exponentially increase it. This is beneficial if you really want to take a deep dive in an analytical view and kind of see where you might have access to. The one caveat I always like to tell people is the loading may take a while, depending on how many relationships you have. Because we're speaking about numbers that are in the hundreds and thousands or potentially more for some clients, even millions. So it will take a while to load. So just be patient with that. Another thing with roles, you can target by board, C-suite, and other. Other is anything that does not fall under the top two categories. But there's this section called include prior. I've actually spoken with a client right now about, kind of changing this, but include prior more or less is saying, I want to include prior employees at these organizations and, include them in the results. So for instance, it would be, okay, you have a connection to so-and-so through AIG because he used to be an independent director there 5 years ago. I usually don't recommend using this, but sometimes it's nice to take a look at. So the other big thing is, so I talked about first degree relationships and second degree relationships and the difference between them, as well as the prior, as well as the roles. But let's say, okay, you don't want to see a breakdown of your relationships, you want to see a breakdown of an individual. You can do that. So let's say you have a board member. In this case, I'm going to put in Neil Goldman, our founder. Type in Neil's name and select them from the dropdown. And then hit apply. All right, so what's great about this? First, it's going to take a look at Neil's public data. So this is not Neil's personal relationships. He hasn't tagged this. This is public data that we have. And so we believe, Neil has access to a certain number of people, his virtual Rolodex, and just for visual sake, what I'm speaking about is this Rolodex. So it's 4,333. So right here, this relationship summary. That's what's being input into here. And then you can drill down by industry, by location, etc. to who Neil knows. Why is this useful? One of the most popular questions or requests I get, especially from nonprofits, is I am looking at a board member's specific relationships, their virtual Rolodex, or maybe a trustee, or maybe a high-level donor, and I want to see if he can, help us invite some attendees to, a gala we're hosting for an honoree in Chicago or in New York, or they're just specifically looking within a certain city who he knows there. There's really no easy way to do that with RelSci. There's a couple workarounds, but it's going to take you a lot of importing, exporting, etc., as many of you may know. So the best way is discovery. You put in their profile, you pop in here, and to take it from the top, you put in the person you're looking for, then you click by location. And then you drill down by location. Okay, we're like, okay, who does Neil know in Chicago, for instance? Okay, third one down, pop this up. Looks like he knows 215 people there, potentially. These are the organizations he knows in Chicago, which if you're targeting foundations in Chicago or other organizations for a partnership, or, if you're trying to get in front of someone there, that's another potential use case here. We go to people, and these are all the people Neil knows in Chicago. So you can do this with a board member, or a trustee, or a high-level donor, or maybe one of your colleagues if you want to use their public data. And take a look at, okay, what roles they matched on, are they involved in nonprofits, with corporates, etc. So this is one great use case. So you can use discovery for individuals and public profiles. Same thing with organizations. So maybe you want to use your public profile for your organization. Maybe you want to use, you're doing some research on, let's see, American International. Okay, how far is their range as an organization? And now we're taking a look at American International. It's just taking a look at all the executives, all the board members, and all their relationships and seeing where there are connections and how it breaks down. Now, a few things to note. Usually, if you're doing an organization, there'll be another option that pops up, include corporate hierarchy. And usually for organizations, you do want to switch to second degree. Small note. Now, answering your questions, Amy, I was not ignoring it. I was waiting. There is probably one of the best use cases for discovery, and why I push this feature so much is because you can use lists in discovery. It's another great use case for lists and makes lists more powerful and discovery more powerful. So why would you use lists in discovery? Number one, let's say you have a board member's actual Rolodex, and that is just virtual Rolodex. You can actually get a real breakdown of who he knows and how he knows them and what industries, roles, and locations they're all involved with. It's very valuable. Report that out. That's great. A few other things. If you have a, let's say, donor list, see how they're connected. You have a parents list, see what parents could get you where. Attendee list, etc. Lots of different use cases, but one of the great things about lists is, number one, you can see where they can get you and how they, what that makeup will look like in terms of industries. You can take a look and see the one-hop paths from this list, but more importantly, you can just take a look at the analytical view of the list itself. So if I put in a list here, let's say I do the Forbes billionaires list. So I select it from the drop-down. And then it actually will add another option here. So unlike with organizations, with individuals, etc., instead of just first degree and second degree, we'll add a people organizations on the list. And what this does is it actually breaks it down on the list. So you can then analyze, okay, we have 100 people on this list or 1,000. How are these 1,000 people connected to, what industries are they involved with? So it's not looking for connections from the list, it's looking at the data within the list and how that kind of works out percentage-wise. If you report that out, you can do some Excel pivot tables and see, okay, we have 500 donors, and of these 500 donors, 40% are involved with private equity, 30% are involved with hospitals, and the rest are mostly involved with investment banking. That's one way to do it. Some location, it looks like 80% of our donors come from New York City, and 20%, 15% come from Chicago, and 5% come from somewhere else. Maybe we should focus on expanding Chicago or going into another area. So that is the first module. And one thing I do want to pull up is there's another reporting option in Discovery that you may have noticed. So there's a lot of reporting features within the tool when you're in the tool. There's also a Create Report button at the top left here. So if you're a big CSV person, a huge Excel nut, if you will. I love Excel, but I know some people are much more well-versed in it than I am. Then you might just want to go in here without even using the tool. You can decide where you're going to, where are you going from. So my relationships, you can decide it to. So in this case, if you do all relationships, that's just the standard RelSci, the first module. You can decide first or second. You can add certain roles, filters here, excuse me. You can do additional fields you'd like to include, how many results you want, and then generate a report. And this report ends up looking like this. Hopefully everyone can see the report. I'll try to expand it so everyone can kind of see what the columns are about. So it's just what Discovery shows you, but in a CSV format. It tells you the name of the, in this case, organization, the entity ID of the organization. That's just the unique identifier for RelSci. The description, number of strong relationships you have to it, average week, the top connection point there, the top connections entity ID, and it just goes over, their role, the shortest path you have to them, if the organization has revenue or number of employees, market cap, assets under management. It lists the sector, the industry and cause, and this will vary depending on what type of report you're pulling, if it's focused on people or focused on organizations. So many of you that are well versed in Excel can now see why pivot tables would be so great. Or if you do the right formula, you can count, how many social science research organizations do we have access to? How many museums, how many retail, etc., and then break that down by percentages. All right, so I'm going to move on to the second module. So the first module is all about taking a look at what you're inputting and seeing the analytical breakdown or how it can get you somewhere. So, it's a top-down view. My relationships, I don't want to go somewhere. I just want to see where I have reached to. So it really is actually a relationship web. It's taking a top-down view of, if you have 1,000 relationships, where can they get you? And then it tells you. And the more relationships you add, the further that web will increase. Unlike Pathfinder, which is really just a specific web between you, your firm, and a specific list or person. But why I always say Discovery is much more than Pathfinder is, first, it's more analytical. And it's more about the data you can pull and kind of how detailed you can get through the results and who you can take a look at, what you can do with it. You can't look at a board member and see, I want to see what city they're in. You can't do that in Pathfinder, but you can do that in Discovery. And I will answer your question, Amy. I am not ignoring that entirely. I will answer that question at the end of the webinar about relationship webs. I actually might host an entirely different webinar about that, since that's a very common question. However, if other people that are attending are interested in relationship web and what that is about, and has no clue, please write into the questions, as Amy is doing, and let me know, because I'll actually maybe devote some time at the end to briefly go over it. I know a few of you already are very well versed in Rel Web. All right, so the second module, what is this about? If the first module is all about what you're inputting and how it can get you connected in general to the RelSci universe, second module is in a way a blown up Pathfinder. So what this is doing is it's taking two sources of relationships. So it's taking my relationship web, in this instance, the Forbes Billionaires list, and seeing where, in this case, first degree relationship, where is there overlap? So who do we know that's on the Forbes Billionaires list? In this case, it's being broken down by organization. But it can also be broken down by person. This is really only useful for a few different types of firms. First, if you're a for-profit and you have many users, that's when it's useful, because you'll see who has connections where. If you're a nonprofit and have kind of an older setup and have multiple boards with multiple accounts, that's when it's useful. Also with RelWeb, it may be useful as well. If you have multiple lists and you want to see where they're coming from, that's another use case. So hey, our regional board in Chicago has access to this individual or has the most connections. It looks like a regional board in Florida has the second most connections. And it's a little different when you hit Explore Relationships. It doesn't actually pop up with that nice pie chart. It just kind of goes right into the details of who you have access to. What organizations, and then what people. And this is all overlap. So, who are we overlapping with? So from the 4,132, who do we have a direct connection to? In this case, we have a direct connection to 674 individuals on the Forbes Billionaires list. With the organizations, it's not as important because we have access to 674 people, because the Forbes Billionaires list is a list of people. And through these 674 people, we have access to potentially 4,167 organizations. All right, just like the first module, the second module can also be changed. So if you hit change here, there's a lot more options. Don't be daunted, it's relatively intuitive. So there's that. The role selection is, again, you can kind of filter down. You can include corporate hierarchy or not. You can include prior, which I usually never suggest to hit. There's a few edge cases you might want to include it, but usually not. There's, you can include by organization, by person. And then there's first degree relationships, which we've seen. Second degree relationships, one hop away. And then an interesting thing called no relationships. So no relationships, I find extremely useful for some firms, and depending what you're doing. It's taking a look at who you don't know on the list, or what organizations you don't know. And maybe you should start to expand to them or try to get a connection there. So if we click no relationships and hit apply, it'll actually tell you the percentage of the list you have no connection to. So in this case, hey, 59% of this list you have absolutely no connection to. That's useful depending on what you want to do. So if it's a prospect list, hey, you don't have any connection to, 40% of your prospects, or maybe 80% of your prospects, you might want to reconsider your strategies. Or maybe try to, in RelSi's case, maybe you want to go contact a board member and say, hey, would you be comfortable exporting your Rolodex and sending it over to us so we can actually use your real Rolodex to make sure we're getting the right information. So a few use cases for this type of module. I've mentioned it before. One of the big ones is list to list. So instead of going from my relationship web to a list, you'd go from, let's say, Houston Foundations to Houston Foundations. And it's very similar to what I described in Pathfinder. And it actually shows the breakdown of, okay, who at which Houston organizations know each other. Another one would be prospects. So let's say your prospects are Houston Foundations, and maybe you have board members' relationships uploaded. So I select board relationships. I want to break it down by organization. Hit apply. And this is kind of where the small caveat I mentioned before comes from. Sometimes discovery does take a while to load. So it looks like there are no connections to Houston Foundations. We'll try vertical relationships. Make sure that the system is not misreading that. In this case, it'd be good, okay, this board member has no connections to these Houston Foundations, or maybe you can do second degree connections and see if there's maybe a one-hop path you could potentially use. So I'm going to run a quick poll, kind of a general poll. I just want to gauge what, especially since this is the first instance of this webinar, what you need more explanation on, whether it be use cases, if it's reporting, if it actually is just the tool itself. All right, thank you everyone for that. So most people seem to be kind of stuck on one specific thing, which is use cases for discovery, which is definitely understandable. Other people, distinction between the first and second modules, somebody, that can definitely understand as well as reporting. So I'll answer the distinctions first because that's a relatively quick answer, and then I'll get into use cases. So for the second module, really what the difference between the first one is and the second one is, the first one is taking a look at one source of relationships, whatever entity that may be. An organization, a list, an individual's profile, your firm's relationships, and seeing how they connect to everyone in the RelSci universe. So it's looking at all 5 million individuals and 1.5 million organizations. How are they connected? The second module is limiting that. It's taking a look at how do two sources of relationships compare to each other and how they linked. So it's getting a top-down view from two sources of relationships. It's more like Pathfinder in that way. First, a few key differences. The reporting gives you more detail on the organizations and people themselves. And two, it's a different view and a different way of viewing the, different way of looking at the data and how you're connected by organization and by relationships. So if you remember correctly, or if you remember kind of a use case or workflow in Pathfinder that's common is, oh, hey, I have a list of corporations and foundations I'm interested in. I want to go from my relationships to these corporations and foundations. So you do that in Pathfinder. Okay, that's great. It shows you some low-hanging fruit, who you can get connected with. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you what organization are you most connected with, or what organization do we really have easy reach into, or what organization don't we. Discovery does that with that view in the second module. Hopefully that kind of clears up the difference between the two. Now, in terms of use cases, I'm going to say a few that hopefully kind of resonate with some people, especially nonprofits, since we have a lot in attendance, but also some for-profit ones. So the first, for for-profit, using Excel, that is a very common use case in general. So if you want to break down, okay, we have a bunch of relationships here, or in general, I want to see how we're just connected to certain industries, use that in marketing, maybe use that strategically if you're doing outbound for sales, saying, hey, look, we have great success with private equity, or look at corporate. Corporate only makes 2% of our relationships. Let's try to develop that further and try to get in there. Or better yet, maybe you have 40% of your relationships are into the corporate world, but who you're targeting, of the industries you're targeting, corporate makes up 10% of your clients. That's a big difference there. Maybe you should look into that. So that's for profit. Usually it involves more Excel and kind of analytics there. For nonprofit, the biggest use case, as I mentioned before, is taking a look at board members by location, or a list of board members by location. Another one would be, just like I mentioned with Pathfinder, how you can take a look at the connections between individuals. So let's say in Pathfinder, when you go from an event list to an event list. So I go from, let's say, board relationships is an event list. We pretend for now. And then we go to board relationships. I probably mentioned this in a lot of group trainings, a lot of webinars. It's a client idea. I did not create it, unfortunately. And it shows you how event attendees or registrants are interconnected. So that tells you, okay, who might be interconnected. But just like with the organizations, it doesn't say who has the most connections, who's most interconnected. The second module in discovery in this case is, so let's say you're hosting a gala, an event, you want to see who is the most connected person there. Who knows the most people potentially? You'd put the event attendee list in the second module here and compare it to each other and see, hey, so-and-so knows 30 of the attendees. That's much higher than anyone else. Maybe we should, talk to him, see who else he can invite, or maybe you should focus on another attendee, try to get some into lots of different use cases. Some people may use that for seating charts, maybe put him in the middle of the room instead of on the outer edge. So really, discovery is, you should think about discovery when you are trying to explore a new idea, when it's a broad concept. Pathfinder does not let you take a look at how you're connected to private equity or how you're connected to Texas. Well, Pathfinder can't tell you that. However, discovery can. So really think about discovery when it's more macro level ideas, when you want nice reporting features, and you're more interested in about the information than the specific paths available. You can always get specific paths. If I go to my relationship web, so this is what a lot of you will be doing, how to use it, and I'm in location. Now I want to see we're hosting an event in, let's say, Houston. Go with the theme. And I really want to see how we're connected. It's like, oh, hey, look, James Harris here. Maybe even Leslie. I want to invite them to our event, see how we're connected. Click see all here on the strongest path. And we'll open up all the potential paths you have to Leslie. Or to James. In this case, we have a direct connection. If this is not first degree, if this is second degree, that's even more important. You can take a look at details and see how you can get to that individual, that one-hop path, and see how you can get an introduction there. So a few things about discovery. There's a lot of pros here. It's a very robust tool. It's relatively intuitive once you get the hang of it. can do a lot with it, much more than any other tool. It's very different than from Pathfinder, from Power Search, from Donor Search. It's a very different beast, if you will. However, a few cons. Number one, because it's so different, a lot of people don't know where to start. Think macro, as I mentioned before, and just kind of dive into it and play around with it. One of the clients that I talked about with the marketing idea didn't even realize discovery was a thing or that she should use it until she came up with a project. So if you have a project that you don't think RelSci can do, or you've tried it and it doesn't appear to be working, check out discovery and see if that will help. And then if you also have projects, or you're wondering if discovery can help with something, shoot me an email, give me a quick call, and we can discuss it and see if discovery can help with your project, with your campaign, or if there's any initiatives that we can use it during. So it's about 10 minutes before kind of the estimated end date. End time. So I can stick around and explain RelWeb. I'm not sure how interested everyone is in RelWeb, but I know Amy is, so I can talk about that. If anyone has any questions about discovery, specific use case, the algorithms, please write in. I'll wait about a minute and a half before starting on the RelWeb. If no one is, if you're not interested in RelWeb and really just wanted to listen to Rel Discovery, please feel free to leave whenever you wish. Thank you for joining. Hopefully it was informative. If you are still confused or if you still need clarification, shoot me an email, give me a quick call, leave a voicemail, and I'd be happy to give you a call back and kind of sit down for 10-15 minutes and go over it. All right. So I know a few people have been leaving because they already have RelWeb, they know what it's about. So I'll explain RelWeb for the next 10 or 15 minutes and what it's all about. So the standard setup in RelSci, there's really two standard setups. If you're a for-profit, everyone has their own account. So just like this, you have a drop-down, my colleagues Andrew, David, Emily, Jenny all have their own account and they load in their own Rolodex, their own contacts, whether it be LinkedIn, Outlook, Salesforce, etc. The other standard account setup would be a nonprofit one, the old nonprofit one, and what we still do sometimes today, which would be a central account. And this is great because it allows you to put in institutional contacts into that account and have the development team work on behalf of it. So that most development team members will recognize this screen, or they at least will be able to log in on behalf of the account. They'll click in and start working on behalf of development. And this is where they kind of host all their connections. And this is a very popular method, and it's perfectly fine, and I think it's a great method, especially if it's relatively straightforward. You have a board, you have some trustees, you have some high-level donors, and you have some prospect lists. However, if you are relatively tech savvy or interested in getting more detail, or if you have a lot of boards, if you have a ton of regional boards, if you have a lot of trustees, things of that nature, or just want more detail, and to be able to control how your account looks, RelWeb is for you. It's included with your subscription if you want it. However, some people are somewhat confused by it, which is actually understandable. It took me a while to kind of understand. So what RelWeb does is it adds a little button. Actually, go back to my account so I can use it. It adds a little button right next to the Add Relationships button, which many of you have maybe seen during my other webinars. And so what this does is it actually allows you to create what we call relationship web, and it changes what this looks like, so where your relationships are pulling from. So the standard is, okay, you have my relationships, so anything you sync, and then colleagues' relationships, anything your colleagues sync, especially if you have a development account, that'll be the development's relationships. But if you create a new RelWeb, decide who wants to view it. So let's say you want only corporate and corporate partnerships and foundations to view it. That's possible. Only major gifts. So make sure decide who's going to view it. Next step. And then this is where it gets in my opinion, amazing, and other people's opinions very complicated. But either way, it allows you to customize your RailsI experience and where you're pulling relationships from. So you kind of name your RailWeb, call this RailWeb number 10. And shared relationships are your colleagues. The normal RailsI setup. If I hit filter here, you'll see it's like my colleagues David's relationships. The development account is here as well. So this is the normal setup here. But then there's 3 other sections. There's lists. So this allows you to upload, let's say you want your board relationships to act as relationships in RailsI. You can do that. Let's say you have a list of organizations. You can do that as well. So we add that. And let's say we also want to use someone's public profile. So maybe we don't have access to a board member's Rolodex. Maybe it's because they're too busy, we've asked them for too much, or they're very hesitant about giving that information out, which I know many people are. Or more commonly, they're just, asking an introduction from them is, enough work. Asking for the Rolodex would take months, years. So if you hit search, let's say I do Neil Goldman, founder, hit add, then we hit apply changes. So what this does, and you'll see instantly, is it changes the number of boxes that you see on the right here. So the standard is my relationships, colleagues' relationships, and then we have board, and we have Neil's relationships. So this is his virtual Rolodex, and these are the virtual Rolodexes of, let's say, the board. And if you click into my relationships, you'll see that it looks a little different. We have my relationships here. We can take a look at colleagues' relationships. The number there, board relationships, etc. But what's great is when I go to Pathfinder, and really the power of RailWeb comes here. When I go to Pathfinder, and let's say I'll do the Ford Foundation. And select the Ford Foundation. So the standard RailsI setup will say, okay, you have a connection from this person or from this colleague, or you have a connection here. This tells you where you have the connection from. So it looks like, if we go down, okay, we have a lot of from the board relationships. Looks like Rakesh knows Rakesh on here, and Rakesh knows Rakesh, for instance. William knows William. But okay, David knows Joseph. So that's my colleague. That's not a lists source right there. And then we have one here. We have board relationships as well. Looks like Edward here knows Peter. And if we go down far enough, hopefully I can find a good example. So you'll see that it says board relationships. But okay, here's a connection via me, as well as another RailWeb source. But if I go down far enough, you'll start seeing connections from Neil, for instance. Or if you have another list of, let's say, Chicago board, it'll say, hey, from Leon, Leon, we have a connection to Lewis, and we actually have it through the Chicago board, not just the board. So it's a way to get specific. It's a way of saying, instead of, oh, hey, development has a connection to, Raymond, and Raymond has a connection to Lewis, it's like, it just says Raymond has a connection to Lewis, because Raymond's, let's say, a board member of ours. So instead of saying, okay, we have a connection to Raymond, well, obviously, because he's a board member, and then Raymond has a connection to Lewis, it just says, your board member, Raymond, who's on the board member list, has a connection here you might want to take a look at. So it's all about customizing your experience. You can use public data, so, use an organization's profile, use an individual's profile, use a list of people, decide what colleagues or relationships you want to pull for for-profits. That's useful. And what's great is you can actually change it based on groups. So not to get more complicated, but let's say you had 5 separate groups. Let's say you had corporate partnerships, foundations, or if you're a wealth manager, let's say you have East, West, North, etc. You can make a different RailWeb for each group and then switch between them if you're part of those groups. So let's say the admin for corporate partnerships and major gifts. So major gifts could have their own rel web and just view that and just see that. Corporate partnerships and foundations can have their own rel web and only see that. But let's say you are the director. Let's say you're the admin for both. You really help out with a lot of the CRM or polling, the report polling. You can switch between those two views and change your rel sci experience. So it's all about the customization there. So if you have questions about rel web, it is definitely more of a strategy talk whether or not to implement it. I've had some clients trial it out, make a separate group, give 1 or 2 people the capability, have them try it. And some people really don't like it. It's either too complex or not intuitive, or it's too much work. And other people love it. I'm actually someone that was on the webinar earlier, uses it and absolutely loves it, and changes it up every day, tries different things, customizes it. So if you really kind of get annoyed at having to email me if you want to change your account, try rel web, shoot me an email, and we can schedule a call and talk about it. So if there are any questions about rel web, you can write it in now, or we can schedule that talk at a later time. So I'll wait about a minute